Once upon a time, in a quaint village nestled between rolling hills and verdant forests, there lived a sweet little girl known to everyone as Little Red Riding Hood. Her name stemmed from the beautiful red velvet cloak with a hood that her grandmother had made for her, which she adored so much that she scarcely wore anything else. Little Red Riding Hood was cherished by all who knew her, but none more so than her grandmother, who lived in a cozy cottage deep within the woods. One sunny morning, her mother baked a batch of delicious cakes and filled a small basket with goodies. She called Little Red Riding Hood and said, "My dear, your grandmother is feeling under the weather. Take her this cake and a pot of butter to cheer her up." The little girl was overjoyed at the prospect of helping her beloved grandmother, and immediately donned her red cloak. "Remember," her mother cautioned, "go straight to grandmother's house without delay. Do not stray from the path, and do not talk to strangers." Little Red Riding Hood promised to heed her mother's advice and set off with a skip in her step. The birds chirped melodiously, and the scent of wildflowers filled the air as she entered the forest. The path was familiar and comforting, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. As she walked, a sly wolf observed her from the shadows. He had heard of the girl's sweetness and innocence and thought she would make a fine meal. Approaching her with a deceptive smile, he greeted, "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood. Where are you off to this fine morning?" "To my grandmother's house," she replied, remembering her promise not to dawdle or speak to strangers. Yet, there was something disarming about the wolf's manner. "And what might you have in that basket?" the wolf inquired, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Cake and butter," said Little Red Riding Hood. "They're to help grandmother feel better." The wolf licked his lips and thought quickly. "What a lovely bunch of flowers," he remarked, pointing to a meadow nearby. "Why don't you pick some for your grandmother? I'm sure they would brighten her day." Little Red Riding Hood hesitated, but then thought of her grandmother's smile. She thanked the wolf and wandered off the path to gather flowers. Meanwhile, the wolf dashed to the grandmother's house with a wicked plan in mind. He knocked on the door, disguising his voice. "Grandmother, it's me, your granddaughter." The grandmother, weak and bedridden, called out, "Pull the string and the latch will come up." The wolf entered, and without a word he pounced on the poor woman, swallowing her whole. Then he dressed in her nightgown and cap, crawled into bed, and waited for Little Red Riding Hood. Soon the little girl arrived, her arms laden with wildflowers. She entered the cottage and approached the bed. "Grandmother, I've brought you cake and butter," she said, but then she paused. Something seemed amiss. "Come closer, dear," croaked the wolf, feigning a weak voice. Little Red Riding Hood approached, and as she did, she noticed her grandmother's appearance had changed. "Grandmother, what big ears you have," she said, her voice trembling. "All the better to hear you with, my child," replied the wolf. "And what big eyes you have," she continued, her heart beginning to race. "All the better to see you with," the wolf growled. "And what big hands you have," she whispered, stepping back. "All the better to hug you with," the wolf snarled, his patience waning. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Little Red Riding Hood said, "Grandmother, what a terribly big mouth you have." "All the better to eat you with," roared the wolf, and with that, he leaped out of bed and swallowed Little Red Riding Hood in one gulp. With his hunger sated, the wolf crawled back into bed and fell into a deep sleep, snoring loudly. A huntsman passing by the cottage heard the snoring and thought it strange for the old woman to snore so loudly. He decided to check on her. The huntsman entered the cottage and immediately realized what had transpired. He saw the wolf, belly full and asleep, and knew that the beast had eaten the grandmother and the child. Thinking quickly, he took a pair of scissors and cut open the wolf's stomach. Out tumbled Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, both alive and unharmed. They quickly gathered stones and filled the wolf's belly with them. When the wolf awoke, he tried to flee, but the stones were so heavy that he fell down dead. The grandmother, Little Red Riding Hood, and the huntsman rejoiced at their escape from danger. Little Red Riding Hood learned a valuable lesson that day, to never stray from the path and to always be wary of strangers. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood spread throughout the land, a story of innocence, cunning, and the triumph of good over evil. And from that day forward, Little Red Riding Hood never forgot her mother's wise words and lived happily ever after.